So, hidden away behind an obscure statue puzzle in a back corner of the Shadow Keep is probably my favorite area in Elden Ring. Guarded by only a couple loyal tree sentinels stands the Shaman Village, ancestral home to a now practically extinct race of people known to us only as the Shamans. And if you've been keeping your eyes open, exploring up to this point, you likely already know what became of these people. They were subjugated, tortured in the cruelest manners possible, and subjected to agonizing and humiliating rituals while their culture and history was stomped out by the other major faction in the region, the Hornsent. Now, while terrible, this is hardly a standout event in a world that is more or less defined by never-ending brutal conflict. But right smack in the center of town lies an active incantation left by Queen Marika. You know, bigoted, hateful, mass-murdering Queen Marika. And it's a minor Erdtree, left to protect and heal her home and people, despite the fact that there's no one left to save. And the reason I like this so much is that Marika finally feels like an actual person, instead of this, domineering enigma. Suddenly, her methods and brutality make a whole lot of sense. Now, the war crime victim to war crime perpetrator pipeline isn't exactly subtle, because FromSoft games are almost deliberately unsubtle with their themes and motifs once you figure out what the fuck is going on. But the pipeline is realistic. It's something we've seen dozens of times looking at real historical conflict. And being that we all know how Marika's story ends, it kind of cements the game as this cautionary tale about people failing to overcome the cycle of violence. And it's probably a good time to mention that nothing in this video should be considered comprehensive or objective. These are just some notes I jotted down while playing through Shadow of the Erdtree again, and I figured why not share them with you. Now, we know what Marika would do in retaliation for the atrocities against her and her people. She would reciprocate tenfold. The Hornsent would be crushed and humiliated to much the same degree as the Shamans. Though there are actually quite a few Hornsent still alive and in their proper form, so you could argue that Marika was, in a way, the more merciful conqueror. I'm not going to argue that, because Jesus fucking Christ, but theoretically you could. And I'm sure someone trying to take an impartial, disconnected view of the conflict would tell you that Marika went too far in the Land of Shadow, that she killed too many in too brutal of a fashion, and that not every Hornsent was her enemy. Because that's, probably true. But I also think any reasonable person would say, how much can we really hold it against her? It isn't the responsibility of a victim to offer forgiveness, and if you belong to a culture that's this enthusiastic about committing genocide, you kind of have to be ready to roll with the punches. I think the greater tragedy of the situation is that Marika learned the wrong lesson, and what could have been considered a necessary evil to begin an age of golden prosperity was instead just the first act in a long, long era of suffering. Because of course it was. Being a live and let live hippie got all of her loved ones killed, while destroying her enemies and erasing everything they believed gave her the power to shape the world as she saw fit. You don't need a fucking degree in psychology to understand why a person, God or not, would stick with what works. Now fast forward to the age of the Erdtree. Marika has sealed the evidence of her atrocity, along with her own son, out of public view and out of the annals of history. Because they happen to grow the horns that the Hornsent considered divine, she's slaughtered or imprisoned the Omens, including 2 more of her sons, and despite there being little to no evidence of anti-tree aggression on their part, she's carried out a risk prevention genocide against the fire giants, save for one survivor who she's cursed to inadvertently do her bidding. And none of this, not the shunning of 3 children, not the damning of someone else to the same horrific loss that she's endured, not the general decay of her empire, has yet sparked self-reflection. That wouldn't come until the next generation of violence came back around, when Ranni executed phase 1 of her plot by murdering Godwyn, who was debatably the coolest of Marika's children, and really the only one making a genuine effort to foster any kind of peace in this awful fucking world. This was probably the point at which Marika realized she'd been having a 1,000-year bruh moment, and she decided to shatter the Elden Ring in an attempt to tear this system down. She did, for all intents and purposes, attempt to break the cycle. Unfortunately, she was about 3 genocides too late. Made prisoner by the Greater Will, she was forced to be idle as her remaining children, raised in a violent land by a prolific war criminal, took to warring with each other and destroying the world for the privilege of making all the same mistakes over again. Even the CEO of Stockholm Syndrome, King Morgott, who has every reason in the world to fight for the end of this age, is too damaged by Marika's actions to know better, defending what Marika herself has abandoned right up to his own miserable death. But this is all old news. The character I still have a little difficulty nailing down in moral terms is Mikola the Kind. On the one hand, he does seem like one of the very few who saw the situation at hand for the completely avoidable rolling faceplant of tragedy that it was, and wanted to bring about something truly different. On the other, he is such an absolute fucking dirtbag. He's like the most extreme personification of the ends justify the means, trust me bro, except no they don't, because your plan is really dumb. But what makes him interesting to me is seeing him as a contrast to and a product of Marika, because he saw the problem under his mom's rule, the victim to perpetrator pipeline really being more of an infinite feedback loop that ensured warfare and suffering would never end. And that's by no means an easy or even possible problem to solve, so I do applaud him for coming up with something. It's just a shame that, from what I can tell, his solution is the mental enslavement of all sentient life. I think it's a safe bet that, since his primary ability is charming others to do his bidding at the loss of their own free will, his age of compassion is really an age of total mind control, where everyone is simply forced to get along, with his new snuggle buddy Radon being more or less a failsafe to dispose of any opposition that can't be controlled, similar to how Marika used Godfrey as a tool to deal with fire giants. And in lieu of any broader context, that plan for world domination would sound cartoonishly evil, but I really do think it's the plan of a guy genuinely trying his best given the circumstances. The unfortunate reality of things is that even kind-hearted people are inevitably shaped by the violence they inherit, whether it's been inflicted on them personally or not, and a person's worldview just can't realistically go beyond what they see as being possible. And that's kind of a flowery, abstract statement, so let me reel it in a little. Morgott experienced horrible abuse and neglect from his own parents and the broader world every single day of his very long life. And the idea that that was all for nothing would be incredibly difficult for someone in his position to even make sense of without going insane. And so, his worldview dictated that he deserved it. Mikola, on the other end of the spectrum, spent who knows how many centuries viewing a world of endless bloodshed fueled by people who thought violently, despite many clear opportunities for peace. And so, his worldview dictated that people don't really fucking deserve to think, and I have the ability to do it for them and do it better. He's just a more majestic rendition of, like, the Master from Fallout 1, in both his goals and the moral dilemma he pushes onto the player. I mean, seriously, they have different means of getting where they want to go, but functionally the same outlook on the world and a similar narrative means of reaching that outlook. Except while the Master was coping with the results of a nuclear holocaust, Mikola is coping with his own mother's bullshit. But there is one more wrinkle that makes these two stand out from the pack and might just recontextualize this entire ramble into nonsense, which is that Mikola and Marika are literally gods for at least some amount of time, and they abandoned humanity and ascended to godhood at very different points in their lives. Marika was presumably a young, somewhat normal woman who answered the call out of desperation as her people were being exterminated, and she herself had likely just survived Hornsent experimentation. Mikola, by contrast, had already lived a long life as a powerful demigod beforehand, and likely had a much better grasp on what godhood actually entails than Marika did. It's made clear throughout the DLC that shedding humanity is absolutely no joke, as Mikola had to discard even his capacity for love, which is kind of like the one thing that might have made his Age of Compassion work. And am I some fucking crazy Golden Order zealot, or does that revelation totally earn Marika a pass for most of the awful things she did in the name of pragmatism? I mean, probably not really, but just look at her situation. She's staring down a genocide and is practically forced to abandon herself and her way of life to save the shamans, only for it to be too late, and then be left devoid of most human emotion with no purpose except revenge and the installment of the Greater Will's order. When we talk about people being unable to overcome the violence they're born into, that's usually figurative. It's saying that those people unfortunately choose violence because it's what they're familiar with. In Marika's case, she was legitimately stripped of the capacity to care. Brutality was a foregone conclusion, and you could argue she was less a willing participant and more so its avatar. If anything, her despair at the death of Godwyn and shattering of the Elden Ring makes a pretty somber suggestion about the tiny shred of mortal feeling left in her and the grief it's had to endure. Now you could say that's a pretty generous way to interpret Marika's story, given that most of the problems in Elden Ring's world are still basically her fault, so you might assume I'd be similarly lenient with Mikola, but not so much. I'm kinda coming to the conclusion that he's way worse. And that all comes down to the timing, because the femboy spent centuries, if not millennia, executing his plan for world domination. To this end, he inflicted unimaginable suffering on a brother he claims to love and admire, forced his sister to nuke thousands of people with the worst disease ever, and framed his other brother as a sexual degenerate that everyone should kill after he'd already spent eons suffering alongside Morgott. And these are just the big things we're explicitly told about. Fucking Lord of Compassion over here has unironically inflicted more suffering than most other demigods, and that's before he purposely threw his love into a pit. Mikola feels like the embodiment of righteous hubris, like a classic Greek deity. He is so fucking sure that life under his rule will be better that the widespread agony required to get there doesn't really matter, and the erasure of free will is fine. It's more than fine, because it's for our own good. We just don't realize it like he does. And that's me speaking as a player in the world, by the way. I'm not quite that schizophrenic. And I know that the horse is basically decomposing at this point, but now that I've railed on Mikola a little more, I'm gonna beat it just one more time. Evil is a pretty heavy word, and it's one that I don't really think applies to almost any major character in this game. They're certainly arrogant and misguided and often cruel, and I do not mourn the fact that we as the player have to put most of them down, but it's impossible to have a well-rounded understanding of them and their flaws without acknowledging the fact that they basically never had a chance. Because at what point in fighting for change, the only way they know how, within an objectively terrible world that sorely needs it, are any of the demigods supposed to stop and think that maybe they're wrong? And public consensus seems to think that that goes doubly for Mikola, because I don't really see anyone lining up to defend Rykard's crazy bullshit, for example, but there is a lot of discussion on Reddit and other public forums about how Mikola's actions are not only excusable given the circumstances, but legitimately good, and that the player shouldn't oppose him. Now it's Reddit, so don't, take it seriously, but these people do a great job of illustrating the point that Mikola's rule does, on the surface, sound like a vast improvement over the world he's been given, and depending on your personal morals, the major downsides might not even seem like an issue, apparently. Obviously, I do not agree, but that's not super relevant to the point. which is that Mikola is a victim. Forced to bear witness to endless cruelty, it seems he eventually just lost faith in the organic capacity for good, which in and of itself can't really be held against him. The same way that Marika's hatred of the Hornsent is understandable, and the Hornsent's subsequent hatred of the Erd Tree is understandable. That doesn't exclude any of these parties from accountability, but it does shine a light on the near-hopeless tragedy they were all born into, and raise a question about what the actual solution is, if any. And I love that it's a question that FromSoft doesn't even attempt to offer a solution to, because none of the game's endings actually do all that much to fix the state of this world. Instead, it's a question that's constantly pushed onto the player, in both a verbally direct sense, e.g. Melena's yapping, and in just the never-ending reminders of your situation, being someone brought back from death for the sole purpose of being a violent puppet wielded by the powers that came before. Because what, if anything, will make us better or different? Anyway, I'm all out of bullet points, so I guess that's the video. If you have anything you'd like to add or subtract, feel free to let me know, and I'll talk to you guys later.